Welcome to Security and GRC Decoded, the podcast where security, governance, risk, and compliance professionals, CISOs, executive leaders, and practitioners can stay ahead of industry trends and challenges. I'm your host, Raj Krishnamurthy, founder of Compliance Co. Join us twice a month to bring you expert insights, actionable strategies, and real-world stories to elevate your security, governance, risk, and compliance programs. Each week, we decode the complexities of GRC to help you make smarter decisions and drive innovation in your organization. Let's dive into today's conversation. Welcome.
Hey. Welcome to another episode of Security and GRC Decoded. I'm your favorite host, Raj Krishnamurthy. Today, we have a fantastic host with us, Steven Asifo. Steven has more than 10 years of experience in security. He has worked for fantastic companies like Verizon, Yahoo, Verizon Media, Ernst & Young. He has been, and most importantly, I don't think I've ever get to say this, Steven. He's also a stand-up comedian. So, Steven, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Raj. Very honored to be here.
Steven, what is the intersection of comedy and security and GRC? Tell us that.
Man, it's a small little overlap. There's a small overlap where those things intersect. That's why there's not so many people you meet that do that. I actually stumbled upon it myself. It's not something I woke up one day and said, what would be really cool is if I decided to make people laugh and tell people that there's vulnerabilities everywhere. There's not too many things there. But stand-up comedy was something I started as like a passion project when I was an auditor, and I was like, man, I can't do this every day. Like, I need a different outlet. And then when I, got more into my role in cybersecurity, then I was like, oh, well, it's cool because my 9-to-5 work happens during the day, and then stand-up comedy, for the most part, happens at night. But the overlap is in both cases, the real thread between both of them is they're both centered around communicating to humans. Like, I think a lot of times we think like cybersecurity is about like technology and like, oh, we need the latest tool to do this, or everything's a failure because, some system didn't do that. But at the end of the day, like the number one vulnerability and the thing that we're always trying to communicate with are people and humans. So at night, I am communicating ideas to humans, and during the day, I'm doing the same, but like from a different context and lens, and trying to translate all this, either technical things or things that we are or bad things we want to avoid, and trying to influence people and get them to say like, hey, you know what, that does make sense. Like, oh, I get that now. And all right, well, what is the behavior that we should be trying to drive? So I've kind of found like that now becomes the thread between this world of like stand-up comedy and cybersecurity.
Okay, and how do you talk about vulnerabilities, adversaries, and hackers? Right? How do you present this differently if you have to?
Yeah, and it depends. A lot of it is like context and like who the audience is. So if you're working with like, the engineering teams or within like your own security team, obviously you can get into like the details as to like, what is the specific exploit? What is the payload? You can use a lot of like the technical terms there. But then when you're talking about, well, who is responsible for remediating it, or like who's responsible for helping to prevent that? That might be someone on like in the business. That might be, maybe like a sales engineer or whoever that may be. Then you kind of have to think about, well, what is the lens or context in which they're approaching that, and looking at, well, I think it kind of depends on like where the stage is. If it's like that we've already identified and we're trying to like get buy-in that this is something that we need to address in a timely manner, then we kind of have to frame it in terms that they understand. And that could be financial, which, sometimes when we're talking about vulnerabilities isn't always like a direct one-to-one. So what I think is the most common course of action is using like analogies, right? Like I think that's an easy kind of one-to-one between like the world of stand-up comedy, but then also cybersecurity. Is like when you use analogies, you're able to create a world where that is very familiar with folks, and it's easier to explain things or have people also contribute on ideas without having to spend that much time. So if I say, cybersecurity folks, we're kind of like doctors for an organization, right? And then everyone's kind of familiar with the relationship with like a doctor. You go in somewhere, you have a checkup. They're supposed to tell you some things that you could be doing better, like you should exercise more. But every time you go back to the doctor, like there's something that you could be doing more there. And when it comes to vulnerabilities, again, you have to kind of understand the context of it. But you could say like, imagine this system is like your house, right? And right now you have like a broken door to your house, right? And we want to fix that broken door. And so now they can play around. Well, okay, well, why do I want to fix that broken door? It's just my back door, right? Like the front door has a lock on it. So now we can talk in the same terms, but like without getting so technical, unless right that audience requires that. So, yeah, so it's a lot of like context and knowing like who the audience is and what do we really need them to do.
Got it. No, I think this is very interesting. One of our recent guests was Tom Skidori. Tom made a very similar analogy around EKGs and signals and doctors and specialists, and it's very fascinating here.
Yeah, and I think in the role of like cybersecurity, there's only so many things we can compare ourselves to. Like there's like the doctor analogy and like that industry there. There's also kind of this like, I don't want to say like law enforcement, because we do use a lot of like militaristic terms of like, attackers and defenders and like very absolute. But that doesn't always translate to, again, like audiences that are outside of cybersecurity. So I think within cybersecurity, like that's very common because we can borrow things. But like outside, I think it's using things that are a lot more accessible there. So like in the GRC context, when we talk about risk appetite and risk tolerance, like no one really wants to talk about that. No one really wants to have to figure out what that is. But when we talk about like how do we help the business go fast, we can say, hey, there's Formula One or NASCAR, right? Like let's say like the business is that you guys are on track, you guys are competing, you guys have to get where you need to go. And risk appetite would then be saying like, all right, hey, this is probably how fast you guys want to go. Tolerance is, we're now in your ear saying like, hey, if you hit this bend a little bit too far, you're going to crash into that wall. That's going to be in a very expensive car that is now going to take some damage. So what we'd like to do, we're just guiding you in your ear, familiar with Formula One. There's always someone in your ear just giving you some information. Hey, pull up for a pit stop. But like our goal is we want to win the race. We're here to support you. But like we just gotta throw some information your way, because in that analogy, right, the business is still ultimately driving the car, but we as like the security team or GRC, we're really trying to act as like guides in that sense to like provide actionable and helpful information. Not just saying like, well, hey, here's a list of all the different things that are on the road right now. Like, what am I gonna do with that, bro? I'm driving. But if it's like, hey, like this car coming up front of you has like a flat tire, that everyone hitting this bend is going over 50 miles per hour or whatever it is. If you take it 45, I think we can nail them. And then, okay, I could do something with that.
Got it. No, I think this is, and a big part of, stand-up comedy is, like you rightly said, know your audience, right? And know the message that you're giving to the audience. Maybe let me ask you a few personas, and I want to get your perspective of how do you think about them as your audience, right? And what is that you think that they would like to hear? Let's say VP of engineering.
Yeah, so VP of engineering, okay, so VP of engineering, the way I kind of think about them, and it depends just a tad bit, right? So if you have a VP of engineering, like for a consumer-facing product or something that like has external-facing customers, they have like a product manager or, some maybe business VP that they're trying to support there. So they need to get things done ultimately. I'm quite sure they would like their product to be up to snuff, but there's also like, I need to make this dollars. I need to get things out. I need to be able to move at a certain pace here. Like if you're costing me money, you're costing this business some things there. So when we talk about things that we would like to be able to get them to do, it also needs to be in the context of like, well, what is going to allow this product to be like successful or move forward as well? So if we're talking about identity type of solutions there, or if we're talking about maybe vulnerabilities that are taking their team's time away from actually working on features that are go to market, right? Like, hey, if we are working on like better preventative or patching mechanisms, your team would spend, X, Y, Z amount of hours less on just trying to keep up with these vulnerabilities that we're patching. You guys could be working on these features that you guys have in the backlog. So that's like one, I guess, subset of that persona. The other subset of that persona is then maybe more internal, like VP of engineering, like within like a central tech organization or within a CTO there. Obviously, you're focused on the organization. You're trying to empower and be like that horizontal bridge there. So you're kind of aligned with like security, but at the same time, you have internal customers that are demanding on you. So it's not necessarily like there's one VP, like one business unit VP. You have multiple business unit VPs sometimes that are like, hey, I need this support there. So that can be either more challenging or more like, hey, what can we do to really support one another and
Got
doing
it. Got it. So essentially, how do we help you ship your products faster? At least how do we not slow you down from shipping your products faster?
Yeah, and I guess to go like one more piece is like, who are they trying to serve? Like by me making their life easier, who are they able to better serve? And just understanding like what that dynamic is, I think puts us in a position to then really think about like, why should they care? What's going to help move the needle for them? Because I think everyone, well, not everyone, but like to some context, like we approach situations like, well, cybersecurity is the most important thing ever. And like, if people don't care about it, then they just don't care about anything in the world, which isn't true. It's just like everybody's in the middle of their own war. Everyone has, I don't have a better analogy to say this, but everyone has like a master that they serve in some context, whether it's a customer or they're a VP, whoever it is. And until you understand that dynamic, you really can't help somebody because then you're really just seeing it from your own perspective.
Beautifully said. How about a CISO?
Yeah. So a CISO then, and I guess at the CISO persona, and I hope I'm doing this right because that means my boss is usually happy. But when you think about the CISO, I mean, like they are, thinking about like the strategy, they're thinking about budget, and really when things make it to that level, it's because either it needs to be like a need to know, or there's a decision. But like a lot of things need to be vetted before it gets to them. Like if I'm pulling in the CISO for every single, and this again depends on like the size of the organization, and the context of it, whether you work for um, uh, a consumer facing or like a SaaS product there, like or a security product. But I think in general, right, like as a CISO, you're covering like the entire organization. You're working with other C-suite executives because you need to know, well, who do I need to either bump shoulders with to say, hey, look, we need to make a decision here, or where do I need to start asking for resources? So it really needs to be something that's been vetted, where they're just choosing between option A or B, or they can ask the right questions to get to that final decision. But they really hopefully shouldn't be having to get into the weeds because they have a team that has worked out a lot of these ideas and issues. So trying to raise it up a little bit high level, and obviously, your CISO has enough breadth and depth to be able to ask their questions that we can go into that if they need to. But at a higher level, we're trying to then say, what thematically, where should we be going? What are some of the key things that we're calling out? And if they need to ask more questions, we have that for you. But we don't want to take more time than we need. Here's the decision point that we need from you as our CISO.
Got it. I can go on, but I think that you make a fantastic point, Steven. And you, as we were talking about the VP of engineering, right? And Jason Chan from Netflix used to say this many years, and he used to use this word: guardrails, not gates. Guardrails, not gates, right?
Yeah.
And so, how, in your experience, how does the GRC team become this guardrail and not a gate?
Yeah, and so the guardrail gate, shout out to Jason Chan and what he's offered the industry in that take there. I think it's something that a lot of organizations definitely aspire to and want to build because it's one of the easier ways to kind of position yourself as a partner when not everything is like, oh, we have to go to security for this and we are the department of no, because everything has to go through you. But if you can put some of that context and information out there to begin with in like structured ways, that allows some opportunity. So from a GRC perspective, obviously you have like policies and standards, which are kind of more of like your written tablets that are probably somewhere in like a intranet or something like that. But how often are people reading that? So that it's helpful as a reference, but it's not helpful in like every day I need to make a decision. So there's areas where you want to be where the decision points start to take place. So, for example, when individuals say, "Well, I want to work with a vendor," and I guess I'll back up for a second. It's like I really do think like as a GRC organization, like our value that we add, like the one thing that we do that no one else in the organization does is guide the organization to make reasonable, compliant, cyber risk conscious decisions. Like I don't think there's anybody else in the organization that wakes up every day to say like, how do we do this successfully every day? There's sister teams like privacy does it from a privacy perspective, legal does that from a legal perspective, but like I think that is one of the core um one of the core purposes of like a GRC team. So kind of going back to tactically, what that looks like is trying to get where that decision point takes place. Because if you really want to enable the business, right, like you want to be there or try to get as close to that like idea of when this takes place here. So we think about like, I want to work with a vendor there. It's like, well, what is that? What is that like process or look like? All right, well, when I normally work with a vendor, I have to go to procurement. So it'd be great at that time when procurement is asking for either like a purchase order or even asking for certain information that we're right there with them to say, hey, we're able to provide either like a list of certain requirements or things or accelerators that would then say, if you guys are looking for vendors, maybe here's some things that already exist, or here's some things that we can write off. And then if you take this to the vendors that you're looking at, it might even speed up the process for you getting them onboarded or integrated because these are some of the existing policy requirements that we do have. So that's just kind of an example there. There's also, a set of things that we can do from a control standpoint where you kind of bake that in, where you make, the safe choice, the easy choice. So instead of having to say, hey, here's a number of configurations that you do, right? As a GRC team, you can work with your, sister teams to set up baselines and, different control configurations that like it out the gate, you already have these things kind of baked in. So he's like, I kind of know what's expected of me. And if I go out of that, I know what I need to do in order to get approval or so on and so forth.
Okay. And a big part of storytelling has to be backed up with data, right? And I think that builds credibility and trust. I'm sure you would agree. But how do you go about collecting this data? I mean, this seems to be a big challenge, right? About how frequently do we collect? How accurately do we collect?
Yeah. So just in the broader context of data, it's hard. I know what we say it's easy, like, oh yeah, we'll just get some data on that and do that. It's a hard problem because you either have like too much data and it's like, well, trying to filter it down to something that's like meaningful, or you don't have enough data. And the way that, I've tried to approach it, because I've been on both ends of that spectrum, is really focus on like the outcome that we're trying to achieve with this, whether it's like a metrics or trying to, present some sort of like a report or bring a conclusion on like a hypothesis. It's like, well, what decision do we ultimately want to drive if we're capturing this? So, and because by doing that, you can kind of work backwards to say, well, ultimately, if we want to be able to influence, let's see, the effectiveness or, well, let me back up even a bit. If we want to be able to influence, uh, let's say like, applications that are like onboarded to like a certain identity solution there, right? Because ultimately, we know that if all of our applications are onboarded to a certain identity solution, it becomes a lot easier for us to kind of manage configurations, know what's there, know what's not there, and then be able to kind of manage privileges between that. Like that would be ideal. So we can work backwards to say, like, ultimately, we want to drive that number up. What data would we need to be able to do that? Well, we probably need to know like the entire population of apps that are in there, which can be hard with shadow IT. But then we'd also like to know within that, well, how many applications support this like single sign-on or whatever solution that we're looking for. That would be great to know there, because you can drive that as an adoption piece to say, okay, let's go out and work with vendors or work with people that maintain this relationship to kind of have them drive that up. And that makes it then easier to say, okay, well, what information will we need to be able to define that? But it's hard when you just say, well, I have a bunch of data. Let's just try to like make something out of it, because you're either then driving the wrong conversation possibly. Because again, people's attention is only so much. So if you sold me, 5 metrics, I would hope these are the metrics that matter to me. Otherwise, like, why are they here? If you show someone too many metrics and it's like, okay, well, I don't know which one is the most important one to do. And if you tell me all of them, well, that's still going to get confusing quickly. So I hope they're like consistent. So yeah, the data situation, either too much, too little, but I think the right answer is like focusing on like what is the outcome that you want to drive at the end, and then working backwards to say, all right, do we have that data? And if not, what is that? What needs to get compiled in order to drive that action?
Got it. And you have worked for a very tech-forward company, Steven, and whenever you come to the realization, and you, like you said, you backward track, right? And this is the story that I want to say. Here are the metrics that support that story, right? And here's how I'm going to collect the data for the metrics. Who does? I mean, there is some amount of engineering and automation work that needs to happen, right?
Yeah.
Where do you see that work happening? Is that within the GRC team, or is it outside the GRC teams?
It's definitely a combination of both, but it's also one of the hurdles in this idea of one metrics and then just using data effectively. So unfortunately, it kind of depends on the organization and some of the context in which I've addressed this or had an opportunity to work on it is there will be maybe like a central team that might solve for the organization. Say, hey, we have like a platform or a dashboard where other teams are reporting in metrics for certain assets there. So you say, okay, well, how do I build into that? Now they may solve it for, their use cases there, but then we still need a way to get, security metrics onto that. So one of the things that we've worked on within our own GRC team is like really creating like a pipeline from like where our work takes place to, where this, lack of a better term, like this grand central Union Station is. Like if you think about like trains, it's like, hey, we know our like region is over here. We're just going to create like a railway that kind of takes it to this situation here. And the real cool thing about that is now we've created a vehicle for the rest of our security team. So if we decide as like a security leadership team, it's really, really important for all leaders in the company to like be tracking against this metric. Normally, we would create our own dashboard, manage it over here. But if we know now that there's like this one central here, we've built out a pipeline solution using like MySQL, setting up like an S3 bucket, and then passing that through there, which removes a lot of like the headache for other teams. Let's say it's incident response or, cloud security, whatever it is, to now also benefit from that relationship there. But there's also now like more tools that like you don't necessarily have to go that route, whether you use like, a Tableau or like a Looker piece. And I think that kind of depends on like the culture of that, the organization that you work in. So like there's been situations where our leadership says, hey, I want to be able to use a dashboard when I have one-on-ones with like other leaders in the company. So maybe it's like a Looker dashboard, or maybe it's Tableau, something that they can just spin up and everyone has access to there. Or it's kind of like what I said before, where like everyone in the organization, we want to be able to come use this information and then it's like whatever that grand solution is. And then sometimes, believe it or not, it's just a slide deck or a spreadsheet. And is it hell on earth? Yeah, it is. It's hard to maintain, but if it gets the job done and people are happy with it and it's driving like an action, a decision, sometimes that's what it is too. But what I've found is like it definitely is helpful to have the GRC team help own that and help build that connection there.
Okay. What do you think, in your experience, Steven, how do others perceive GRC within the company? And let me give you a very specific.
Yeah.
How does the leadership team perceive GRC teams and the value that they add?
So in the context of my organization where I work, now I'm very fortunate to say that we very much have like a strong relationship with our other teams within cybersecurity and also like outside of the cybersecurity as a whole. It's kind of a bit broader, but we've put in a lot of work over the years to like build a lot of trust with like our brand as like the paranoid cybersecurity team, which is fantastic. Like just even like that name, like anybody can be paranoid. So like the vision of what we're trying to build is like this like shared culture where everyone can be a little bit like, oh wait, should we be doing that? Like we should probably kick the tires on this a little bit more. Like that's really the outcome there. And where GRC has helped to show up over the years and why I think that's been, you know, a dedicated relationship amongst everyone. We're like, hey, look, we want GRC in the conversation. It'd be great to bring someone from GRC in. Is again, like we really wake up every day thinking about like, well, how do we guide the organization or help guide this team to make a reasonable, compliant, cyber risk conscious decision? And sometimes that means doing the work that no one else wants to do, which could be, helping to document, maybe helping to like negotiate things like across like engineering and business terms there, because not every team has the opportunity to kind of be a little bit creative on like, if you're doing a product security review, to say like, okay, well, yeah, you guys don't really have to meet that requirement, and that threat model doesn't really matter that much. Like, no, the part of that, threat model or review means like I need to look at what are the critical things, and I have to let you know about it. But GRC, we can kind of come in and then help model like, okay, what are some of the compensating controls in there? How do we kind of roadmap that? What are we really trying to protect, and what would it look like to influence that to like a manageable state? And we can help bring that up in like, a few months once we have a plan on that there. And nobody, I don't want to say nobody, but that's not everybody's favorite thing to do. But GRC, like that's a role that we play when it comes time to like helping enable like sales and like in the compliance front. Like we are working with external vendors to like answer security questions for them, making sure that when it comes to like PCI or SOC 2, like, and that's not something that everyone wants to do, but we are very well versed to kind of wear a couple different hats. And what I tell people is like we're kind of like the Draymond Green of cybersecurity. And if you know Draymond Green, like on the Warriors, is he's a core piece of the team. Everyone knows Steph Curry. Steph Curry shoots threes from like the parking lot. He puts up 40 points a game, runs around. He's like one of the best players to ever touch it. They got Jimmy Butler, another all-star there. But then Draymond Green, he's a core part of the team. He does defense. He does all the hard work that no one else wants to do. He's got to guard the people like Wembanyama. He's got to guard LeBron James. Who wants to do that? You don't see like, Steph Curry wanting to do that every night. He's got to go down and shoot threes. But Draymond kind of plays that central role to just make sure the ball gets to where it needs to go. And sometimes do we get a little physical with people just to make sure we get the ultimate decision? Yeah, we can do that. But yeah, that's kind of how I frame what we do as a GRC organization. And I'm very fortunate that, our team and like our organization has done that. But that's really because we built trust with like the services that we've offered and like the value, and being very clear on that value that we're providing to our teams.
Okay. No, that's a fantastic analogy. How do you see risk, compliance, and governance?
Oh man, it's the classic three-headed, lack of a better word, monster there. And I guess when we say like, how do I see it, is just like in today's world, or just like how they relate to one another. Like, I guess
how do you see them relating to one another? How do you see them reinforcing one another, and how do you see them adding value?
Yeah. I mean, it's probably like I'm trying to see if there's like a unique way for me to answer it aside from like what you can just get in like a textbook. But I think the most prevalent, it really should probably be like RCG, or something like that. Because I think the risk piece is something that's always comes first for a lot of organizations. Like you don't necessarily have to have a robust team or a robust approach to address risk. Like you can in your everyday life think about risk when you get in your car, or when you think about like, different things that come in your life. Risk can be shared across like the organization or different businesses there. So I think that really is kind of the forefront. It's something that we're always trying to manage or keep in scope. And then compliance is something that like you have to do that, especially given the industry that you work in, because if you don't, then you're wrong, right? Like you're not meeting what needs to be, especially if you work in like, say, healthcare or financial industry there. And governance, that is a fun word that can be very loaded for some folks. or it can mean a lot of things. And I think that also has a bit of a cultural context to it, because when we say governance, what we're really trying to say is like we're getting like the right people in the room to make the best decision. That's really what it is. But governance in like a banking standpoint, people are like, yeah, I love governance. We're heavily regulated. We want all that. But then in like a tech, landscape, sometimes what people hear is red tape, right? Like now I have to go in front of like this group and then get that all approved. Like I'm trying to move fast. Like they just released this new version. I have to put my new version out tomorrow. Like what are we doing about that? So there's different ways I think you can frame that. I don't think it has to be like that word by itself, but like the way I think about it is like, how do you get the right people in the room to make the best decision, whether on a periodic basis or just like as needed? But it needs to kind of be in a sense where people feel like, oh, this is something where I feel like I'm getting value that I wouldn't have gotten anywhere else. Like it's quicker for me to get where I'm going by like meeting with you guys than for me to kind of go alone and try to figure it all out. So that's kind of like how I see them all relating. I think, risk is the one that's most prevalent everywhere. You never get rid of that. Compliance is something that you have to address, you have to do. And then that governance piece is a lot more cultural. So when I think about like where our own GRC team organization is going and like really what the vision is that we're trying to build, like we're not trying to build a cool risk register. Like honestly, nobody in the cares about that. Like I've never once heard my CISO, CEO, or head of product wants to be like, what really made me happy today? I had a risk register when I was like, nobody talks about those stories. But like the stories that people talk about, when I listen to like my VP or when we get excited hearing from like other leaders is when they talk about like, well, hey, we identified like thanks to XYZ being detected, we were able to catch, this incident or issue before it went live, right? Or like, oh, we saw some malicious activity here and we were able to report to such and such, and that helped us save so much money. Or, we were so worried about fraud, and with this new mechanism we implemented, we actually saved XYZ amount of money. And that's really that like shared responsibility or like that shared culture of just being like a little bit more paranoid and like, well, how do we kick the tires on this a bit more? Or how do we kind of get ahead of this? I think when we hear more stories about that across the organization, everyone's like, oh my God, like this, we want more stories like that. But nobody really cares about like, oh, well, we got all these policies. So everybody's got controls now. Like nobody wants, that's not why we exist. And that's not the stories that we go on and tell when we talk about wins.
And is it about the tools we have, or is it about the stories we tell? What is the issue here? Because ultimately this is about capturing risks, right? Understanding what the impacts are, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one part of it that is just raw data. But how do you take that, digest that, and say that in a way that appeals to people, that resonates with people, is a whole different ballgame, right?
Yeah.
So where do you see the gap is today?
Yeah, I think the gap for this today is, it kind of goes back to like the data problem, is that there's either a lot of information we're trying to digest into, who we're trying to talk to, or maybe there's not enough. And then we start trying to grasp at like, well, what's going to help make this clear for somebody? And, as like working in like the space of like stand-up comedy as well, all I do is like try to take ideas, either my own they're using my own ideas, but like taking topics that either people have a relationship with or don't have a relationship with, but then putting it in a format where everyone can then kind of grasp it and say, oh, okay, I get it. But in stand-up comedy, it's a bit different because the kind of end result is like this like moment of laughter where everyone kind of has this like, haha moment, right? Whether it's like a deep laugh or not a laugh. And I can get feedback on it really quick. Like if nobody laughs at it, then I'm like, okay, well that didn't work. There's a word, but I think this is why I like stand-up comedy so much, and I'll tie this back to like security, because like it's usually like a word missing. So like sometimes they call it like the funny word. So if I say, this is not going to be funny because I'm doing it on the spot. And this does not mean I'm not a comedian, but it's just because I've been talking about security and it takes a little bit for my brain to switch back. But like if I say that, my neighbor next door parked on my driveway, he's a real like, pickle stick or something like that, right? Like pickle stick, it becomes like the funny word. Like I would put that at the end versus like if I said like my neighbor's a pickle stick, I hate when he parks on my driveway. there's like just rearranging of words, like in wordsmithing, and then thinking about like, well, what does my audience already know about this topic that I can just already build on? Do I use a like analogy here? And so like that's what goes through my mind when I think about like communicating, is starting with like, well, who's my audience? What is the most important thing that I want them to know? What is the most important thing that I want them to do? And then working back to say like, what is like the like least amount of information that I can give them where they can all come to that same conclusion. Because if you go to like a stand-up comedy show and it's just like, a soliloquy, just long words to do that, like it's not good. But if you watch like stand-up comedy on TV or like late night, it's very like wordsmith. Like you're using the least amount of words as possible to get to the result. Because if it takes me, 2 steps to get somewhere versus 10 steps, I'm a lot more efficient and I have more time to like, get people there. And as an audience, I'm very, very respectful. If you're like the VP of engineering, if you're my CISO, that you're very busy. Could I explain this risk to you over the course of like an hour? Oh, I would love to. Let's sit down. Let's go through it. But if I can do the same thing, in, 3 to 5 minutes, I'm quite sure you'd be happier. Because, like every time Steven gets in front of me to explain something to me, I know it's going to be like, I'm going to get it. It's going to be straight to the point, and it's going to be very clear what needs to happen next. And so I think that the challenge is like sometimes we take so much information and we think everything's really important. Well, they need to know this detail and they need to know how the vulnerability exploit, and they need to do this, that we don't then say, well, what do they need to do next? Or we talk about like, well, everyone needs to do this, but we don't talk about why it matters. So it's really thinking about like from the human aspect of like, what is going on in my audience's head? Why do they care? Right? Like what's going to keep them here? And then what do I need them to do? And how do I make it as easy as possible for them to do that? Right? Because it could be at the end of like my little spiel and say, well, right now, all we really need you to do is to kind of have, your team join this like call here, push this PR. And we already have some templates from other teams that we've shared. So if you just review that, we'd be ready to go as soon as you are. Okay, so now you see that there's an end. If you're on the other side, it's like, okay, well, there's an end. Sounds like there's support. So like the barrier to do this becomes a lot easier versus if I came to you and said, all right, hey, look, this is the issue. We need you guys to kind of push this out. So come back to us when you guys can. It's very open-ended. Like there's no real commitment there. There doesn't sound like there's much support. It kind of is like, all right, well, I'll just go do what I was going to go do. So are we really partners? Like what does that situation look like? So it's really just thinking about it from like a human perspective of like, what would make you feel like I'm getting the help I need or being guided to like the best decision.
Got it. I think if I sort of put myself in the, to your stand-up comedy example, when I go see a stand-up comedy, right? I am vulnerable. I'm relaxed. Maybe I'm not. Vulnerable is not the right word. I have my guard down because there is no obligation on me to remember and act on something. I'm there to enjoy the moment.
Yeah.
But that's not the same in a boardroom or when you're presenting to your leadership team, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of the message that you're saying, I'm 100% in agreement, but how do you bring them to this common denominator? How do you let their guard down so that they can relax and understand what you're trying to say? Is there something that you do there when you...
Yeah, and I would say it's still fairly similar because, I mean, you'd be surprised. I mean, I've performed, your classic bar shows, and the bar show, it's a trick because sure, people might be drinking, but they may not always want comedy. Now, that's a tricky spot when people don't want you talking at all, which could be very similar to like, a boardroom or like a VP is like, why are you talking? Like, why? What are you doing here? And so you have to kind of like break and so in that instance, you kind of have to like break the expectations. You either have to like say something that like captures the attention or be very, very present. And that's what I found is like is usually the trick is like being very present. Like if I know it's like a rowdy bar room, everyone's doing that and don't want to hear comedy, it's like, I'm not going to get up there and do my act that I've been doing for the last 5 years and like, hey guys, I got married last year and you won't believe what's going on in Kentucky. Like, who cares? Why do I care about that? But if I get up there and then say, hey, look, they're making these drinks so strong. I just got up here. I don't even know whose microphone this is. Now people are like, who is that up there? Right. And I'm talking about like what's going on present day. I still may not win the room, but at least now I'm thinking about like what is going on in this audience? Like what is relevant to them? I think that's what I mean by being present is like you can have a script and you can say, well, this is how the textbook says you should talk about risk, but like nobody cares about that. It's like, well, trying to think about like what does this audience care about? Like what is the context in which they're coming from? Who do they serve? Like what are they going to go do after this? And so I try not to treat every single audience like it's the same whether it's like cybersecurity or whether it's like stand up. Like sure, I may have like an act or I have a way that I communicate risks or ways that we normally address things, but it's going to be different between business units, just like it's going to be very different between crowds. Like they're going to have different motivation factors. So I do my homework beforehand. I'm always a student of this. And I think it does take a little bit of time to do it, but like it's like that repetition that you then become very good and have certain tools to frame it. And there's sorry, I know I'm kind of rambling on this, but like even as you're going, you can frame yourself as the bad guy, right? Like I know security, we say, well, if nobody likes us and it's hard for us to work. Sometimes you can lean into that. And that can be fun too, to say, hey, look, I know I'm the worst person that you want to hear from right now when I tell you this, and it's going to be bad. Like, I'm just going to tell you right now, it's going to be bad. It's going to be a big number. So now you're anchoring that emotion. Is like, all right, what do you got to say? What do you got to tell me? And then what you have to say doesn't even sound that bad afterwards. Like, look, everyone's got to take this training, right? I just we're 13% off, and that's what I need you to do. And like now I disarmed them because I took you all the way up here, but what I said kind of down there, And then sometimes you can play like a little bit alongside to say, hey, maybe you have someone in the room that you're already have a relationship with, and you can kind of use that to build up. So there's different ways that you can use it, because at the end of the day, you're talking to people, right? Like we complicate it because we're like, well, there's all these technical details that we have to communicate, but like people are people. And once you learn how to communicate like a human, like this becomes a lot easier to like help communicate information and digest. It's like, well, what do we really need them to do?
Got it. No, that's brilliant, and that's beautifully said. Have you ever received a feedback where said, this is supposed to be a very serious talk and you're just diluting it? How dare you, Steven?
I will be honest, I've never gotten that. I've never been in like a situation, and I would say, because I've done like, the presentation when people say, hey, I don't agree, like I'm not doing this. I've even done comedy shows where people just like, this isn't funny, right? Like, so like I would be honest with you, Raj, if I was just like, hey, something's not connecting here. But I've never been in a situation where someone's just like, this is a serious topic, this needs to be boring. Like I want this to be something I can't engage with. But like, even if, because again, it's all about context and timing. So I'm not saying I go in there and I crack a couple jokes all the time. Like, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is like, there's a way to present information where it is compelling, where people can engage with it. People can, say, hey, I resonate with it. And it's different in cybersecurity because you're not looking for laughter. You're looking for like, maybe like, that's right. Or maybe like, you know what? That is the pain I'm feeling. Like that's a very different emotion to be able to pull out. But no, I've never once been in a situation where I said, you know what? This was supposed to be boring and you made it, interesting. I've never been in that situation.
But, I think on a different world, for example, in product management or product engineering, right? There used to be two schools of thought. There, I think, continues to be. One is sort of loading all of this in a PowerPoint presentation, and this is sort of very ugly set of presentations that you can ever see. And then there is the other school of thought, which is typically the Amazon school of thought, where you almost write it like a newsletter, allow people to read and ask you questions, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, when you're presenting this, there is some prop, something happening. And that's not there in a stand-up comedy. You just have a mic and you're just telling your story.
Right, yeah.
How do you do this when you present security stuff? What props do you use?
Yeah. Man, this is definitely like a skill. I know people say like, if you are, I don't know what people say, but I'm going to say it because, sometimes people say, if you like, they live in slide decks. At one point I made so many slide decks. I was like, I dreamed in slides, and people say, oh, that's bad. You're not doing real security work. But no, like I was really thinking about like, well, how do you use this space effectively? Because I mean, again, just thinking of like from a human context, if I put like a wall of text on a slide that looks like, an Apple iTunes agreement, terms and agreement there, your eyes are going to glaze over. And then people get up there and read it word for word. You're like, well, why do I have you here? I could have just read this on my own if you're just going to send me a novel, And then the way that I think about it is, again, going back to like how do I make it as easy as possible for people to do what I want them to do? So even if there's like 20 like pages on the text, is like, why? Like thinking about like, what is the most important thing I need to communicate on this slide? If your eye doesn't immediately look at it without me talking and doesn't say the same thing that I'm saying, then I need to remove it, right? Like I need it to be visually like consistent with what I'm saying. So if you look at it, because I mean, you've been in presentations before, like the slide deck goes up, even though you're listening to someone talking, you're already glazing over, going ahead of them, because audiences are smart. That's the same thing in stand-up comedy. Like if I say, hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the
Clock.
the clock, right? You can finish it yourself. You didn't need me to say it because audiences are smart, and that's why, comedy becomes fun because you can break what people are expecting. But when it comes to like, the boardroom or like putting together a presentation, if what I'm saying isn't consistent with what you're seeing on the slide, or your head is going up and now you're wondering, well, why is that number there? And that number doesn't agree with what you're saying, then you become confused. You're not even thinking about the message that I'm saying anymore. We're on a whole nother topic. So I try to say, let's keep the least amount as possible, or if it doesn't support the key idea, remove it. Like there doesn't need to be like, 10
100%.
different ideas.
But I think I think one of the challenges, I think as an engineer, I've been caught up with this all the time in my life, is that I don't want to come out as somebody who has not done the work. I want to show all the work that I've done, and I want people to see it, right?
Yeah.
And at the cost of completely missing the point of what I'm trying to communicate.
And the fun thing, nobody cares. Nobody cares, man. But that's a great thing about like an appendix. Put your heart and soul in that appendix, man. Like, but if it's really like, and it is hard. Like a lot of stand-up comedy is just editing. Like you have like, people will go through 10 different drafts, 20 different drafts of like a joke. Just like I would go through like, 10 different drafts of like, a memo or like, a slide deck, because like I'm constantly just asking myself like, all right, is that important for my audience to know? Because again, your time is valuable. If it's not, then I need to cut it because I could use your attention to focus on this idea here. So then all that other deals, because you're a smart guy, if you ask the question, we can go to the appendix. I would love to talk to you about risk for an hour. But if I only have, 5 to 15 minutes, which really that's usually how long you have at an executive level, I need to be right on the money. Everything I'm saying ties back to this key idea. So I'm using visual things here. If I put a number here, it has to be very, very clear what that number means. Context is like, so I'm very, very serious about like what I put on there has to be consistent and has to make it as easy as possible that when you look at it, whether I'm talking or not, you get to the same idea.
Got it. And if you were to dream of a GRC solution, right? What would the GRC solution look like?
Oh man, if I had to dream of a GRC solution, I'd have to think about like what problems I would want to solve. And the problems that I would want to solve are one problem that I'd like to solve is like being able to make sense of, and when I say I'll get to like what it means to make sense of like the disparate information that we have across like the security team, but like kind of putting that up against the context that we have for like these different products. Because I think that's where a lot of things kind of come to play, is like if I'm thinking about like the most important thing that I do is like guide the organization to make reasonable, compliant, cyber risk conscious decisions, right? Is I need to be able to know like, well, what decisions are being made? Like what is the context in which they're operating in? So as we're doing reviews, like different security teams, or as we're, helping them make conscious, like it'd be great if that information kind of all coalesced somewhere. There's the risk register that kind of just says, hey, here's the risk and does that. But making that something that's actionable is tough, because then how much information do you pull out of that you then bring in front of a business owner? So I'd say that'd be one problem that I'd like to solve, is like getting kind of like the right information in one place to make, an actionable decision, not just like for my team, but then for other teams, generally on the security side. For the business, what would be great to make easier is where they don't necessarily have to know all the different like policy controls or ways that we support them. So like, for example, when it comes to compliance or when it comes to like sales enablement, when it comes to working with the third party risk management, like it's great that we can get involved, but like if there is a way when they're starting that onboarding process, like some of these questions come up as they're going through it on their own, or they're being guided through that before we even get there. So they're starting to think through that. Like that would be fantastic as well. So trying to like integrate some of like the business, some of like the work that we're doing into the business process. So that way we're not coming in as like an afterthought. It's like some of the things that are just
Makes sense.
a part of the piece that are making there. And then I think those are the two things that come to my mind during this piece here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think if I a few years ago, if I'd asked about storytelling, we would have talked about developing a Tableau report, developing a Looker report, developing some of that stuff, right? But I think Mosi Platt said this best. And he said that we are in an interesting world, especially in security and GRC, because if you find the right data, what the large language models and generative AI allows you to do is to allow allow the person to write their own stories. Right? And I ask you this question because you're big on storytelling, right?
Yeah,
I think
for sure.
Is the entire consumption model or the consumption layer of GRC changing with what we can possibly do with the likes of ChatGPT?
I think so, because I know this is something that like my team has been experiencing with is pulling disparate, so kind of what I was saying before, like pulling different sets of information for trying to kind of synthesize it against certain criteria or normalized rubric that we would evaluate things against. But at the end of the day, even though there's AI and all this, like there's still that human element that we have to get to at the end of the day. I think AI makes it challenging, that like storytelling piece, because, you know, in the future, it could be next year, it could be 5 years from now, everyone's going to have an agent that is like making some sort of decisions on their behalf. So now, yeah, you want to influence the decisions of that individual, but maybe you have to go through and figure out what their agent is doing, or their agent talks to your agent. But, you know, there's probably there's got to be somebody somewhere that's pointing that agent to do these tasks. And so stories is like, storytelling is like such an art and like a human element, because storytelling goes all the way back to cavemen, right? Like if you know, a caveman tells a story about, hey, look, Bob was here, you know, yesterday, but a dinosaur ate him. You know, that caveman's going to tell that story day after day after day. Because he's going to say, don't go by he says, there's something about that lake. There's something about the lake that Bob went and never came back. You're going to tell that story. You know, and so, I mean, and now there's different stories that you tell. Like, that's a story of like, you know, risk and fear. Like, so the question becomes like, what do you do with that? But then there's also stories of like achievement and wins, where it's like, hey, you know, by way of working with us or by enabling people to think and work a separate way, here's a new behavior that we've now taken. But storytelling, I think, is like one of the most human things that we all do.
Got it.
And that's something that like we kind of share. Like you sit around a table.
And you're a practical expert on this, and if this comes out any differently, I apologize, Steven. But in the story that you said, right, there was Bob yesterday and a dinosaur. I laughed, and is it because I laughed because it was so silly? And the reason I'm asking you that question is that, but I remember this, right? I mean, I will remember this. And even for many episodes to come, I'm going to say, I had a conversation with Steven and he talked about Bob being eaten by the dinosaur, right?
Dinosaur. But and it's going to sound crazy out loud.
Yeah, but how do you do that? How do you do that on your security reports?
Yeah. Well, okay. So here's, you know, and I know I have to tie everything kind of back to this, but that's my thing. So the fun thing about stand-up comedy, which I believe carries a lot into cybersecurity, is that you're able to tell the truth without getting beat up. You know, now in cybersecurity, oftentimes you're telling people that like their code stinks and because all these gaps are in there, or like their product sucks because all these gaps are in there, and nobody wants to hear that. You know, or at least you have to find a nicer way to tell that to them. But like, you know, in stand-up comedy, if you go back to like, you know, the role of like a jester being in the king's court, you kept him around because, hey, the jester could say things about the king, about whatever, without getting beat up. If actually it was like a prized role because you have to find a very, very articulate way to kind of like toe the line and show people a mirror without necessarily like forcing them through that. And so the way to be able to do that in cybersecurity is, and I guess maybe I have to kind of think about how I do that there, is there's a creativity to kind of shaping. You can do a comparison kind of piece. Like you can kind of put two things side by side. And I think that's a common thing that people like. Like, so for example, if you do like a maturity assessment, people will also want to know like, well, how do I compare against the industry? Right. So I can show you up against, another thing. Well, like, hey, XYZ, similar size companies, have a maturity score of XYZ. We have a maturity score of, this. Right. And that's, largely because, these companies here put this amount of money into it and they do way less. And we do this and put this amount. So you can draw some comparisons and tell the truth.
But what is the point of that? Are you saying that, it is not that we don't suck. In fact, our code sucks, but we suck less than the competitors. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah. So, and sorry, I know it took me a little bit to get to it, but I guess I'm trying to like show there's different ways that you can allow people to, because you don't want, there's an art to like letting people come to their own conclusions. Because like I said, audiences are smart. So like if it's, I could tell you what the answer is, but it's better if you get to that answer on your own.
Beautifully said.
So that's why I was like, in a comparison aspect, you can come to that conclusion if I say, hey, the people that are leading in this market, right, have a certain level of maturity score, are spending this much money on it. We're here and we're also not hitting a certain thing here.
I see.
You then ask yourself, maybe we should start spending on, if XYZ companies are doing that and they're at this, maybe we should do something like that. Because there's something about comparison that feels like that there. There's, and there's different ways to kind of like show people a mirror, right? You don't have to necessarily just force them to say, look, this is what you look like, right? Like that's a little too harsh, right? And calling out people's features.
I think that's beautifully said. That's beautifully said. I think that's a fantastic lesson, Steven. We are approaching the end of the segment, Steven.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to, for this person, not everybody's a stand-up comedian. So maybe I'll give you the last 60 seconds. What should people do? How can we make this entire rigid, dense environment lighter? What can we all do to make this sort of a much more fun-loving place to work?
Yeah, I would say the most important thing that anyone can do, if I only had like a second on your podcast or like 1 minute, I would say a lot of people, there's this myth that cybersecurity is a technology problem and all we need is like, more, engineers and more tools to be built. But really what we have is like a human problem and how we communicate like humans to other humans to help change behaviors and influence behaviors. So what I think we can all do is like think about ourselves as a human. Before you put on like your cybersecurity hat and say, I'm going to go hack the world or defend the world, is like, what would influence my own behavior? Because people try to influence on a day-to-day basis and we make decisions, right? Like people tell you, oh, you should buy insurance because the sky is falling. And sometimes you buy it, sometimes you don't. Some people sell you on up things. And so like just thinking about like, what is that emotion that, brings you to take a certain decision or behavior? And then, trying to replicate that there. Trying to think about like, well, why would I sit through a security training? Like, what does that look like? Why does that have to be boring? Like, think about like what you would sit through. Because at the end of the day, if you wouldn't do it as a human, before you're even a cybersecurity person, just as a human, if you, your kid, your wife wouldn't sit through it, why would you expect somebody else to do it? Just because you told them to? Okay. Hey, have at it, buddy. Have at it. But that's a very hard battle to do than trying to think like, well, let's just make this enjoyable for everybody. Like let's try to make this as like engaging as we can and just make it very easy for people to do what we want them to do. That's it.
100%. Steven, this was a fantastic, fun interview, fun podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me and all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Security and GRC Decoded. We are your go-to resource for staying ahead in governance, risk, and compliance. If today's episode resonated with you, we would love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network. To dive deeper into these topics, visit us at compliancecow.com and follow us on LinkedIn for more insights and community conversations. Join us next time as we continue decoding the future of GRC. Thank you.